You mentioned the green agenda or the green movement. That's been talked about a lot in the last few days. There's been a kind of rolling back of the net zero plans. When we spoke before, you were saying you think that's one of the big issues that is turning across Europe, and that in some years' time we might look back at the net zero era and almost laugh. Do you think that's possible?
I do. I think it's more than possible because, some of the consequences of conventional green policies, I should say I'm not a climate skeptic. I'm a disciple in that regard of someone a great friend of mine who died recently at the age of 103, James Lovelock. James Lovelock used to say, climate science is inexact, but if it has a bias, it's probably to underestimating the speed of climate change. He thought that climate change would consist of sudden jumps, it wouldn't be slow, and it could transform things quite quickly, a couple of decades. We might be in the middle of that now. That's my view. I'm not a climate skeptic. What I am very skeptical about is net zero and the kind of conventional green policies that are being launched for a number of reasons. First of all, they were launched before the infrastructure was there to make them work. They were launched before even the technology had developed that could make them work. No consideration was given to the fact that many of the raw materials that were needed for the inputs to batteries and so on were now substantially or even largely controlled by China in Africa and elsewhere, because it's in Africa that the great game is now being refought of the 19th century. They control huge amounts. Now, they might be found in other countries, Sweden, America, various deposits have been found, but they're not quickly developed. And in the meantime, these programs can't go ahead. Nor were there economic costs of these green programs properly assessed. There was a constant insistence on that they would be job creative. Well, even in America, the best of it, they haven't been that job creative, actually. And remember, America's very big and they can throw very large amounts of money at these things. And they can, to a large extent, the green program, the Green New Deal there, is a protectionist scheme. So they can do it. We can't do that because we're too small, we're too exposed to flows of international capital. We just can't do it. So the idea that in Britain or in Europe, these programs could ever possibly work, it's a bit like suffering from cancer and using candle therapy. That's how it'll be remembered, candle therapy. This kind of period. And then people might say, yes, but we've got to show that we're on the right side. We've got to, even if other people don't give away. I think that's the politics of narcissism. I want to feel good. But in the meantime, you're wasting resources and you're wasting time. If there's a serious possibility that we're now in the early stages of runaway climate change, we should be focusing everything we've got, not on having an infinitesimal impact on global carbon levels, which would be the case even if the whole program was implemented, but on policies of adaptation. Not even of mitigate, but of adaptation. And adaptation is not going to be easy. Some people say, well, we can just adapt. It's going to be jolly difficult, I think, if there's really runaway climate change. But if there is, and if we're now at the start of it and it's not stoppable, remember, most climate scientists would agree that once humanly induced climate change is in the works, the material works, the works of the planet, it goes on for decades or even centuries. You can't just stop it. There's a general idea among environmentalists of a radical conventional sort. We started this so we can stop it. No. We started it probably, but we can't stop it. It's in the works, and it might even be accelerating. And then say, well, shouldn't the world's burning? Shouldn't we be doing something radical? Well, the world may be burning, but if it's burning, turning down your heating in your house is not going to make that much difference, or no difference at all. So the result of it, this is why I was talking to Freddie earlier on, and we were talking about an earlier conversation we had when we concluded, he and I, that we were in an age of tragedy, that we'd entered an age of political tragedy. So I said I'm not so sure about that anymore. I think we've advanced further than tragedy. We're entering an age of absurdity. And I think an example of that would be that German climate policy, which of course Germany, as we know, is incomparably more adult, more advanced, more modern, and in every way superior to bungling Britain, and other countries. But in Germany, the result of their closing down of nuclear and going for renewables has been a reliance, an increased reliance on the dirtiest kind of coal. Well, that is tragic, but it's even more than tragic. It's completely absurd. And the world is advancing rapidly, I think, Western society particularly, into utter absurdity. So that's one of the things we've got to sort of cope with. And if you put these arguments, difficult to do because they start shouting at you, or they start crying, or they say they can't get up in the morning, I rather brutally suggest, well, don't. Stay in bed till you get a better reason for getting up. And if you don't, well, there we are. Progress always has casualties. It's an expression of what one of the great books of the last century in English was a book by the American scholar Philip Rieff on Freud, and it was called Freud, the Mind of a Moralist, in which he said Freud was a Stoic moralist. He quoted a wonderful letter of Freud's, where Freud said his aim in therapy was not to enable people to realize themselves or to achieve happiness. That was not his aim. His aim was to change hysterical misery to the everyday suffering of human life. Now, that was somehow forgotten. That was his aim. And Rieff wrote a later book called The Triumph of the Therapeutic. I think it came out in the 60s, in which he said that a therapeutic model of behavior was spreading in every part of society. Rather than using moral terms or even political terms, people started using psychoanalytical terms. What do you want out of this? Well, I want closure. Well, the thing about Freud is there's never closure. Closure is impossible for Freud. We bear the scars as well as the good things from our infancy, whatever we do. We can't change ourselves with these fundamental respects, according to Freud. And so I think conventional climate policy is the triumph of the therapeutic. People want to feel good. If they don't feel good, but they feel powerless. They don't want to feel powerless, so they deceive themselves. And focusing on the hard question is really, really difficult. By the way, Lovelock told me, not long before he died, that I just illustrate how difficult this is. He's a tremendous figure in climate science, deeply respected by people who even didn't share his Gaia theory and so on. And he said he tried to get some money for a practical experiment. And the experiment would be to put very inexpensive measuring devices on merchant ships as they travel around the world. And the aim of this was to get an empirical, not a model, he said. Models can be completely skewed, but to get empirical, factual data about climate change in different parts of the world. I said, did you get the money? He said, no. I said, why not? He said, I asked for too little. I asked for 250,000. If I'd asked for 250 million, I might have got it. But you didn't need 250 million to do this. Now, why was this interesting? It was interesting to me partly about the money, but also because people have great faith in the models. His view was that the models were backward-looking and were probably underestimating the speed of climate change, not overestimating it, underestimating it. And that's shaped my view of these things. I think we should go hell for leather for nuclear, but we should also start thinking very seriously about coastal areas, water rising, thinking of that extreme weather will become the norm, might already be becoming the norm, and how we actually adapt to those realities to preserve the elements of the civilization we still have.
If you're right on that issue, if you're right at least on the politics
Yes.
of that issue, that it's turning, and it seems certainly across Europe to be headed in that direction,
Yes.
the cost to the former authorities or to the people who've been in charge will be so great, because the things that you're making light of now are real sort of articles of faith
Yes.
of what they consider good government to look like. What kind of collapse follows the descent into absurdity?
Yes.
Because really what we want to leave here with is, whether it's grim or optimistic, we want your sense of what the world might look like in years to come. And it feels already like these authorities are falling one by one. and there are very few institutions or leaders that are kind of trusted.
Well, I think what
happens next?
It's an interesting paradox, and I'll try to answer this, which is I think it'll be part, if there's an optimistic scenario, which there may be, I think, in some contexts, at least in some countries, at some times, then it's one that involves the rebirth of politics. Because the trouble with technocratic pragmatism is it doesn't work. Because what technocratic pragmatism means is approaching what are carefully defined problems defined by conventional thinking, by group thinking, and applying some conventional methods. So they say, well, the problem is really carbon. That's what it is, carbonization. So we've got to reduce carbon. We've got to have net zero. Well, there are all kinds of problems that I mentioned, scientific almost issues about how quickly climate change is already going and whether we should focus instead on adaptation. But there's also the question of political legitimacy. And what's being discovered now is that there are limits to political legitimacy for policies that severely disrupt the practical lives and incomes of large numbers of people in society. So if you impose an ULEZ scheme in an area where there's practically no public transport, most of Britain, or large parts of Britain, or it's unreliable or scarce, that has severe impact on people trying to get to work. This is impact on traders in cities. And there's also the subjective feeling, which is very important, of feeling imprisoned in one of these 15-minute cities. Somebody doing something to you which you resist. And I think one thing which is underestimated is the extent to which law-abidingness is a wasting asset. In the taxi that brought me here, the car that brought me here tonight, the driver was saying that he knows of lots of people who are going around and smashing the ULEZ or disabling the ULEZ cameras. And now, what will happen if the numbers build? The policy will eventually be overturned, or you'll have a period of anarchy. I remember when Thatcher, having tried and failed to impose the poll tax in Scotland. That was supposed to be a trial run. It was a trial run, didn't work, it was a disaster, so she did it in England. It happens to all leaders, whether they be liberals or not. They tend to become anti-empirical. They double up. Instead of learning from their mistakes, they double up on them, or triple up, or quadruple up. And that resulted her in riots and her being toppled. Something like that, I think, could happen in the case of these green policies. But as Freddie's just mentioned, it's a huge blow, not only to the faith, the worldview of the technocratic elites that support it, but also to the perception of their competence. It hasn't delivered any of the results that it's supposed to deliver. It doesn't make any difference. It costs an enormous amount of money, far more than they said. And people are supposedly converting to electric vehicles when there are hardly any charging points. And by the way, someone who's an expert on this made a point to me which I hadn't thought of. He said, well, one thing which is commonly neglected is that if these charging points were installed around the place, they'd be very, very large, much larger than ordinary petrol stations, because it takes a long time to charge up. So unless you can improve the technology, you can charge up in 2 minutes. If each car is in a line and charges up for half an hour, it's going to be huge. It's basically, none of this is going to happen on a big, enormous amounts of money will be wasted. People's lives will be disrupted, and then it will be forgotten. It's more like prohibition in America than it is like a rational solution. It's the most nakedly irrational solution you can have to the growing danger of climate change. So what's the solution? Well, in Britain, I have a little tiny sliver of hope. I'm hoping for a hung parliament. Might not happen because Labour has been rejuvenated by Scotland. But if it doesn't get a working majority, there's a realistic chance, I think, of electoral reform. And the only way we can really, I think, have any new ideas filtering into politics is by creating new incentives which involves the destruction of the existing party framework, which would happen. It would happen inevitably. I observed it happen in New Zealand when they changed their electoral system back in the 90s. The parties would split. They won't split. Even the Conservatives, who hate each other more passionately than almost any other human party in history, they won't split unless there's PR. If there's PR, they'll split immediately into perhaps 2 or 3 parties. Labour will split. You could have a real socialist party, hopefully non-Corbynite. You could have a Green Party, but not a conventional Green Party. You could have a Liberal Party. You could have a Libertarian Party. You could have a variety of parties. And I think that would be a much healthier situation. I think that's still possible. So there's the little sliver of hope.
I'm going to seize it. I'm going to seize it.